Three, two, one. Hi, welcome back to the last section of the module on basics of receptor pharmacology. You've made it this far. This is some pretty complex stuff, and I appreciate your attention and your interest. In this last section, I'm going to go over some sort of odds and ends that didn't fit so nicely with the other neurotransmitters, but I don't want, just because they're tucked in at the end here, for you to think that they're any less important. So I'm going to talk about melatonin, orexin, histamine, endorphins, and endocannabinoids. And we'll talk about how some of these things regulate our sleep-wake cycle, how histamine is a very important player in the central nervous system, as well as your springtime allergies, and also start to explain how retrograde neurotransmission helps to understand how cannabinoids work. So let's start with melatonin. So melatonin, most people are familiar with it because they've seen it for sale as an over-the-counter supplement. It's actually a hormone, and it is important for in training our circadian rhythm to the actual day-night cycle. So you know this feeling if you've ever traveled overseas, because suddenly you're waking up at 3 in the morning because your melatonin release has not caught up with the daylight cycle. So melatonin stops being produced as soon as it gets light out. So when it gets dark, it starts telling our brain that it's time to start winding down. So it is one of the two main forces for sleep, is this circadian rhythm, the other being a buildup of adenosine, which is a byproduct of cellular metabolism. So melatonin originates from the pineal gland. Like I said, it's released there when it starts getting dark. There's a connection to your eyes to let the pineal gland know that it's time to release this in response to darkness. And this is also why we tell our patients and ourselves not to look at bright lights and bright screens right before we're trying to go to sleep. So it, as we talked about in the serotonin lecture, is actually originates from serotonin, which originates from tryptophan. And it is broken down by a number of different metabolic pathways, largely in the liver. And there are two known receptors, MT1 and MT2. And for the most part, the main thing that we're targeting with this is over-the-counter melatonin, although increasingly there are medications that are looking at melatonin receptors as targets. There's one on the market called Melatonin, which is a non-benzodiazepine, non-Z drug, hypnotic drug. So Orexin is sort of plays kind of a counterpart to melatonin, although they're separate systems. This is also referred to as hypocretin. And what this does is it actually stabilizes wakefulness in addition to regulating appetite. Now it's originating from the hypothalamus by just a very small number of neurons that produce orexin. We don't really know what breaks it down, and we've identified two receptors. And what's interesting about this is that it's thought that impairment in this orexin system may help explain narcolepsy. So if we can't stabilize our wakefulness, then we will fall quickly into a sleeping state. Now, interestingly, there's been some interest in looking at this as antagonizing the system as a way of treating insomnia. So by destabilizing wakefulness, the ensuing state would be falling asleep, of course. So histamine is something we're often quite familiar with because many of us take antihistamines, especially when the pollen count is high. And it's important to understand that there are central and peripheral histamine receptors. Now, what do I mean by that? When I say central, I mean on the inside of the blood-brain barrier, inside the brain. And then there are peripheral ones, like inside of our nose. So when we block the ones that are inside of our nose, that's great. We don't sneeze so much and we don't have a runny nose. The problem is a lot of older antihistamines don't stay on the outside of the blood-brain barrier. They get into those central receptors within the nervous system. They block histamine there, and what happens? We get tired, we have cognitive impairment, etc. And so this specificity of those molecules, those antihistamine molecules, is important. And more contemporary antihistamines don't cross the blood-brain barrier. So they're only blocking the histamine receptors in your nose, but not in your brain. So there's four types of histamine receptors, and we largely exploit these for their sedating properties and sometimes some of their mildly anxiolytic properties. So a drug like hydroxyzine, sorry, I couldn't remember it for a moment there, is it technically an antihistamine, also known as Vistaril or Atarax, that we will often use as a non-benzodiazepine substitute for or non-benzodiazepine substitute for either sedation, for sleep, or for anxiety. Now, the problem with histamine blockade is that it often does cause side effects other than drowsiness. It can cause confusion, particularly in older people, and it also can cause weight gain. Now, there is a drug that is actually a histamine 1 receptor agonist, and that's modafinil. So modafinil is Provigil, and that is a non-amphetamine stimulant. So it essentially has the opposite effect of a antihistamine and causes wakefulness instead of drowsiness. Now, the endorphin system, this is where opiates go to dock, and of course we are familiar with this in the regulation of pain, and it also has potential for euphoric effects. We also know that there are opiate receptors in the respiratory centers of the brain, which is why opiate overdoses cause respiratory suppression as a mechanism of death. They also suppress cough, which is why codeine is such an effective cough suppressant. But we also have these same receptors in the gut, which is why we get constipated with opiates in our bowels because of those bowel opiate receptors. So it's widespread throughout the body. There are 3 types of receptors. And most people are familiar with the mu receptor. That's where morphine goes to sit. But there are other receptors as well, such as kappa. And so most of us are familiar with this from pain or from substance abuse. And then, of course, things like naloxone block the opiate receptor. They're opiate receptor antagonists, so they work as reversal agents. And naltrexone also has a similar effect of blocking that receptor. But it's interesting because opiates also appear, particularly buprenorphine, appears to have an antidepressant effect. And this was investigated by the manufacturer to see if it could be combined with a drug called samidorphan, which is a mu antagonist, to essentially block the euphoric effects, but still get the antidepressant effects of buprenorphine. But the FDA felt like it was too risky in the middle of an opiate crisis to be playing around with that. So they cut that one off before it came to market. But it is interesting that opiates do appear to have their own antidepressant effects. Now, endocannabinoids this is interesting that we have a very complex system of cannabinoid receptors in the central nervous system and the periphery as well. And so these do not exist just so we can get intoxicated from the cannabis plant. What anytime you have a receptor, you have, there's going to be an endogenous ligand which plugs into that. So once you find the receptor, the quest then becomes to find what plugs into that. And what was discovered once the CB1 and CB2 receptors were found was that indeed our brain makes its own cannabinoids, and things such as anandamide and 2-AG are examples of the best studied endogenous and cannabinoids. But what it appears that these do is that they actually help to control the release of other neurotransmitters. So it's a kind of fine-tuning mechanism. But we also think that the endocannabinoid system has an effect on learning and memory, which shouldn't be a surprise, but specifically forgetting, which is an important part. If you've ever clogged up a computer hard drive with too many old files, you realize that there's a downside to remembering everything, and our brains are really no different. There are a lot of cannabinoid receptors at the hypothalamus for controlling appetite and sleep. Certain cannabinoids also appear to have an anxiolytic effect, whereas other exogenous cannabinoids, such as THC, in some people can actually be anxiogenic. And this is starting to show up in the, not just in the do-it-yourself pharmacology with medicinal cannabis, or in substance abuse, but also in things like the drug Epidiolex, which is a prescription cannabidiol, which is specifically indicated for a couple of types of pediatric seizure disorders. And there's been some attempt to try and antagonize this receptor. A drug called rimonabant came and went a few years ago, and it was a cannabinoid receptor antagonist with the intention of causing appetite suppression as a weight loss drug, sort of anti-munchies drug, if you will. But it turned out it actually exacerbated psychiatric conditions. So the cannabinoid system is a very complicated and significant one. I want to just kind of give you a snapshot of its complexity here. So you saw this kind of similar idea, but what I mean by retrograde signaling control is, so normally the signal is coming from upstream to downstream, right? We're familiar with this. Neurotransmitters are released, the signal gets passed on down the line. So what happens, so that's antegrade signaling. So in retrograde signaling response, the receptor for cannabinoids is actually on the presynaptic side. So it's like a salmon swimming upstream. So we've got two receptor types, CB1 and CB2, and those endogenous cannabinoids or endocannabinoids are made on the postsynaptic side, such as anandamide, and they go upstream, plug into that receptor side, and essentially say, hey, hold up a second. It's kind of like if you've ever helped a friend move out of a house and you get like 20 friends together and you're passing the boxes down the line rather than individual people carrying them into the truck. This is when the person who's stacking all the boxes inside the truck says, hey, hold up a second, and then that line gets passed down the fire line, kind of like telephone. So this is what the endocannabinoid system is doing in the brain, is creating this retrograde signaling control. And exogenous cannabinoids do the same thing. So just looking at even more detail, so we've got those CB1 receptors on the presynaptic side. As you saw for a second there in the animation, there's anandamide being released from the postsynaptic side going into the CB1 receptor as a partial agonist. 2-AG is another similar endogenous cannabinoid. Now introduce THC, an exogenous cannabinoid, also a partial agonist against these sites. So it mimics the effects of endogenous cannabinoids. There's your breakdown enzyme, and there's a second one, which I don't think I illustrated here. Now, what about CBD? So CBD is actually a negative allosteric modulator. So if you recall, that is plugs in and influences either positively or negatively. When it's a negative allosteric modulator, it decreases the effect of THC at the CB1 receptor. But it has other effects. It works on serotonin 1A receptors. It inhibits that breakdown enzyme. It seems to inhibit the reuptake of serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. It actually inhibits the reuptake of anandamide, and it also works a little bit on opioid receptors, both mu and delta, and this thing called the TRP1 receptor, the vanillinoid receptor, which is thought to have an influence over pain responses. So you can see CBD, it's not surprising that it's purported to have so many different effects, because it is what we might used to call a dirty drug. It is a fairly non-specific compound, and it has a lot of different targets. Fortunately, it doesn't appear that many of those targets have significant side effect responsibilities, so that's probably why it's so well tolerated. But CBD is definitely something to watch in the pharmacologic space. And we think that these receptors for cannabinoids have an influence, as I said, over relaxation and sleep, appetite, pain modulation, and forgetting, and memory. So both side effects and benefits to be had here. So all of these leftover neurotransmitters, last but certainly not least, play important roles, particularly in sleep, appetite, alertness, and regulating other neurotransmitters. And paying attention to a lot of the neurotransmitters in this little module would be wise if you're interested in the future of pharmacology, because I suspect that many of the new agents we're going to see will emerge from these other neurotransmitters that don't get as much press. So I'm glad you made it to the end. Congratulations. Thanks for sticking with me. If you need to go back and review sections of this, I encourage you to do so. Don't despair if you didn't get every single last piece. I moved fast and I covered a lot of material because I know you have the ability to rewind. So I hope you'll do that, and I hope you'll ask questions in the discussion. Thanks for your attention. Bye.